Welcome back to this online brown bag series on follies in fragile states. My name is Ian Quick and this is part 5 of 6, and we are continuing on the topic of geography denial, with the focus now shifting to the second word. We've seen what the physical environment looked like. How did this factor into our planning, into the approaches that we used? There's a pretty solid indication here. This slide comes from a presentation by the Congolese Prime Minister in 2010, and he was explaining a quite sudden and quite drastic 300% increase in the area of operations for stabilisation. The goals that were planned over this area included completion of demobilization of combatants, deployment of police, judiciary, penitentiary, civil administrative officials, re-establishment of economic activity. Now, this plan was not really budgeted. There was no very serious change plan for the central government ministries that would have to do it. So this was very much gesture politics, quite literal hand-waving at a map. But the point that I want to underline is that the Congolese government was simply telling the international community what we wanted to hear. The UN Security Council had done exactly the same thing, had expanded ambitions in exactly the same way. From 2007 to 9, it had put the priority on North and South Kivu, this area it left. That's about 120,000 square kilometers, 12 million people. In 2010, it added Province Orientale at the top right of that small inset map. In 2013, it added the northern part of Katanga province at bottom right. Now, we were looking at this point at well over 400,000 square kilometers, well over 20 million people. The tasks didn't change. The resources didn't change. We were still utilizing around 20,000 peacekeepers, still a few $100 million in programs each year. What does it mean to work at this kind of scale? Let's take just one of these priorities, and that's the mining sector. This is what the physical distribution of mines looks like in Eastern DRC. This map from IPIS lists 1,100 sites over about 2/3 of the area we were just looking at, and the icons represent different forms of mineral extraction. International lobbyists had pushed very, very hard for legalization, formalization of this sector for a number of years. The Enough project is probably the loudest amongst this group of lobbyists. In a typical press release, it argued that legalizing mining sites, regulating mining sites would, quote, change the incentive structure away from violence and illegality and towards security and the rule of law. It would further make mining the main engine for economic development in Eastern Congo. And in a way, they got what they wanted. On the buyer side, due diligence initiatives were introduced in the US and in the OECD. On the supply side, the Congolese government adopted a certification scheme whereby any one of these sites could only be certified green if it was shown that armed groups were not profiting from extraction at the point of exploitation or taxing mineral resources as they moved out of the country. What's telling, of course, is where this regime was actually implemented. And there were several very highly publicized cases where it was. These primarily the sites of Rubaya and Columbia in North and South Kivu. And these worked after a fashion, and they were good initiatives. But they worked because of very specific circumstances. They're very close to the provincial capitals. They're very close to the international border. And this made it possible to have a closed pipeline. There was a closed list of approved transport providers. There was a heavy presence of security forces. The security forces, more importantly, were very closely monitored due to the high profile of these pilot schemes. And that's all fine, but what does it look like in other circumstances, at all these other icons we see scattered on this map? Let's take this mining area near Walikale, for example, in the west of North Kivu. Now, I won't bore you with yet more pictures of roads. Instead, let's look at this guy. He is a porter. He carries 40 kilograms of cassiterite used to make tin about 2 days through the jungle to the nearest dirt road. From there, it goes to the nearest paved road. From there, by light aircraft to one of the provincial capitals. Now, the government certification team refused to visit this site for several years, noting the obvious security concerns of this 2-day walk through the jungle. It also noted that actually certifying the site would require assurances that a security cordon could be established around quite a large mining area in the terrain you see at top right. It would also require policing all these potential jungle routes to ensure that the armed groups that made their habitat in this area were not taxing this element of the supply chain. Most difficult of all these security forces would somehow have to be made uncorruptible through higher pay, better supervision, or some combination of the two. All this finally would have to be done by air on these tiny little aircraft you see at extraordinarily high expense. Now, envisage projecting this to 1,100 more sites, many of which were smaller, more remote, more cost prohibitive. Imagine that, and you begin to understand the hubris of attempting a regulatory rule of law type approach in these circumstances, just as we saw in part 4 when we tried to project a criminal law solution over very big and very, very difficult terrain. Now, the mining example is also interesting because it illustrates a second big problem with thinking and planning at this kind of scale. And that's the tendency to think there's a general answer, a general diagnosis for what's wrong with the Congo. We see this in its most extreme form in maps like this. This relates to the government stabilisation plan that I started this segment with, and what we see is a standardized iconography to reflect standardized interventions. There was a common package of support for justice services that was copied and pasted for 38 different areas. A common package for administrative services, copied and pasted, again, for about 90 different areas. Same for judiciary, same for other sectors. The Security Council, along similar lines, invariably set goals for this abstract entity of Eastern Congo. Programs like the European Union's restoration of justice in the Congo applied to the East, with the problem defined as one of impunity in common across this area. Major donors like the United Kingdom sponsored very, very large community-driven reconstruction schemes. Common approach across, again, vast areas. Now, we can illustrate the basic problem with this thinking in 4 photographs. In one sense, these are familiar scenes. They could have come at any point during this presentation, but in fact, they're completely unrelated. At top left, we have Ituri in 2003. As the Second Congo War ended, this became the epicenter of violence in the country. It became so bad that the European Union deployed its first ever external military intervention. We see French armored vehicles here. At top right, northern Katanga, 2013-14. The UN stabilization mission had to scramble to redeploy peacekeepers here when long-standing communal tensions blew up to the surprise of most, if not everybody. Bottom right, Minova. The Congolese army went on the rampage after losing a battle, leading up to a rare trial of those responsible. Bottom left, Beni. At present day, as I record this, no one is 100% clear what's really going on here, except that a group of Ugandan descent, the ADF, is clearly involved. Now, the basic fact is that these tiny vignettes stretch over about 1,000 kilometers north to south in about 15 years of time. They're the product of very different dynamics, of different experiences under Mobutu, different experiences during the Second Congo War, different experiences after the Second Congo War. And there's a relatively simple way to illustrate this. Here we have an administrative map of territories in North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri. I've flipped it on its side to make it easier to present. What I want to put up now is some illustrative data from public survey work that was done by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative in 2014. First off, on the interethnic issue. These are territories where we find a very high level of distrust of Rwandan-speaking ethnic groups. This is a very big and very important issue in Eastern DRC. Many very eminent analysts say it's really at the core of the cycles of crises that we see in this area. And Indeed, it's played the large part, maybe even the principal part, in the stories we heard in parts 2 and 3 of this video series. At the same time, it's a widespread issue, but it's not everywhere. Look at the negative space here. If we ask that same question about trust between ethnic groups in these other areas, we get very different answers. And I want to give one example in particular. These are territories where we find a very high distrust of people from the Lendu ethnic group. I use this example because it was the epicenter of that violence that prompted EU intervention in 2003. The issue is clearly localized, and the story behind it is a long and very, very bloody one. It goes back really to the 18th and 19th century, when immigration patterns led to wildly confusing and conflicting arrangements for customary ownership of land and of authority. This was made worse by Mobutu, who really botched a commercialization scheme to enable transfers of land for more efficient uses. It was then made much, much worse by the Second Congo War, where there were outright land grabs and forced displacement of large numbers of people. Now, all this finally boiled over in 2003. As the Second Congo War ratcheted down, the crisis in Ituri specifically escalated very, very quickly. It's also interesting to come at this from a different angle. If we simply ask the population what drives conflict in your area, we get very different answers. And one of the most interesting and most prevalent is this: land disputes. Clearly concentrated in the same area in Ituri district, but also very visible at the left of this map in the south of South Kivu. And the implication is very simple. There is no sustainable solution to fighting without progress on the land issue. Now, that will probably sound a little strange because we haven't heard much about land in this brown bag series in parts 1 to 4. And that's not because I've cherry-picked the cases. It's because we really didn't engage with this issue very seriously. In one sense, then, it was a false negative. It was something that we didn't pay a lot of attention to, discounted as a key factor to work on, but in reality it was very, very important. And it was not the only issue that fits in this category. Let me give you another answer to that same question about what drives conflict, and one of the most interesting ones. Nationality. This reflects a very specific historical experience of another immigrant group, historical immigrant group, I should say, in this area, the Banyamulenge. Very long, very troubled history, including in 1981, an attempt to actually strip them of Congolese citizenship. And that issue had festered ever since. During the period that I've been describing in these talks, we see very active propaganda and mobilization by men like William Yakutumba. In the book, I quote letters that he wrote to members of the armed forces, urging them to protect their national patrimony and turn on their Banyamulenge colleagues. In fact, Yakutumba built a reasonable size armed group based on the support he did get from the army and from fairly considerable smuggling interests. It was impossible really to address this issue, the issue of illegal armed groups in this part of the country, without addressing the fear and paranoia on both sides of the aisle here, from the Banyamulenge community on the one hand, and from people like Yakutumba on the other. Now, these stories are very complex. Experts of my acquaintance will already be very mad at me that I have simplified them way too much. By contrast, though, the takeaway is very, very simple. The Congolese state had failed for different people in different ways, and our generic models, our generic remedies did not respond meaningfully to those differences. We failed to recognize that we were bundling together very, very different problems when we talked about a single Congo crisis, this abstract entity of Eastern Congo. Well, that wraps up part 5. Next up is a short take on lessons learned. So please click through for some ideas on what we should take away from how stabilization failed in the Congo. Thank you.